Whoop.
Sorry,
I
Kai. That's
really,
bad.
that's okay. We really wanted to make these data available to researchers because we quickly understood that our capacity to look at all these data and do all these studies was limited because we only have so many analysts in our team, and oftentimes the work we do is directed by external needs, policy needs, and we don't have the freedom necessarily to look at everything that could possibly be looked at with these data sets. So that was kind of the impetus for wanting to put these data sets in the RDCs to really put them in the hands of academic researchers and researchers from other departments. Is the background noise bothering you guys at all? Because there is a meeting that started
We
behind it.
we do
Behind me.
hear it. It's not terrible.
Let me see if I can put my headphones. Is this better? Can you hear me?
I do.
Okay, perfect. That should muffle the noise a little bit, hopefully. Okay, so I'll jump into what the criminal justice relational database is if you wanted to go to the next slide. So, as I said, it was developed to increase access to integrated criminal justice data for researchers external to StatCan. And what this database is integrate. So sorry, the noise is really bothering me, so I'm going to move away from it a little bit. Um, okay, so it consists of a number of data sets that can be integrated together using an anonymous integration key. So one of the key features of this database is that it doesn't include personal identifiers directly on the data sets that are being released. Instead, we have already done all the work to link the data sets together. And in the platform, we provide an anonymous integration key that allows data sets to be merged with each other and integrated in order to create custom analytical data sets that can address specific research questions. So in order to access these data, researchers need to submit a proposal through the RDC platform, which I have a link for later on in the presentation. And the proposal needs to be approved by Statistics Canada, and there's a number of other requirements before someone can access the RDC, such as becoming a deemed employee of Statistics Canada and all that. So I've listed them in one of my last slides, but just to give a broad overview of sort of how to access these data and what they are. And just to the right here, you can see the image. So the core of the database is the justice data. So currently, I'll go into more detail now later, but the core data sets are the Integrated Criminal Court Survey, which consists of court data, and the Canadian Correctional Services Survey, which consists of correctional data. So these forming the core of the database can then be integrated with other data, including tax data, post-secondary education data, data on vital statistics pertaining to death, healthcare, hospitalization data, immigration data, and census data. Some of these data are still outstanding, and we're still working on putting them into the RDCs. But essentially, this is the vision. This is what it's meant to look like. So you can go to the next slide. So the CGRD, Criminal Justice Relational Database, you'll hear me refer to it as the CGRD, just for short. It's really a tool for statistical modeling. So longitudinal models, multiple regression models, stuff like this. It's not meant for custom tabulations like descriptive statistics alone. So obviously, researchers will likely have some descriptive statistics in their papers, whatever is coming out of the RDCs. But really, it's not the correct tool for just these simple custom tabulations that really can be done more easily through custom requests to Statistics Canada. Um, I'll sort of just leave it at that. But yeah, so these are really for those more complex research questions that need more elaborate models to answer those questions. So, as I mentioned before, so the platform consists of two criminal justice data sets. So the first is the Integrated Criminal Court Survey, which basically covers all charges that have been completed in criminal court, youth court and adult criminal court for all provinces and territories across Canada. So this is really a wealth of information. It's a wealth of information for criminal charges and convictions in Canada. And this data set goes back to 2005 and all the way up to soon I think it's actually 21, 22 now. I'll have to double check what's in there, but now I think it might be 21, 22. But essentially, up until the most recent year that we have linked, that will be available to researchers in the RDCs. And the plan is to update these data annually. So, on a regular basis, the criminal justice data sets will be updated. So, you'll have your hands on the most recently available linked data. Um, the second survey is the Canadian Correctional Services Survey. This is a more recent survey at Statistics Canada, and it only started in 2015-16. Prior to this, we had a different correctional survey which didn't collect the microdata required for record linkage. So this is the first correctional survey that we've fully linked, integrated in our linkages. So this one's available from 2015 onward, and it only currently covers a number of provinces. So it currently covers British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario adult data, Nova Scotia, and youth data from Newfoundland. But the CGRD for now only includes adult records. So you can kind of just think of it as correctional records for adults from the provinces of British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. We do have plans to expand the the data that's available for the CCSS in the future. So, for example, we're currently onboarding CSC, so the Correctional Services of Canada, into the survey as well as PI. So the survey is being expanded to other provinces, which hopefully will be able to also include that data in the CGRD in the future. And you can move on to the next slide. I don't think I'll go too much into this, but this was just an example of what like one person's record might look like in the data set. So imagine this, but times several hundred thousands of people. So essentially, I have like a fake ID on the left hand side. So this person basically is number one. And then you could kind of, there's like just a bunch of variables, but I've pulled out some key variables that you would see on the data set, like they were processed in adult criminal court. You can see when the case started and ended, when the charges in that given case started and ended, because someone could have multiple charges in that in a case, and what the federal statute was, the section, and then we have our classic sort of standard groupings for offenses, like this person was charged with this is all fake data obviously, but sexual assault, criminal harassment, drug possession. So that would consist of one case. And then you can see the decision outcome. So 2 of the charges were found guilty, 1 of them was withdrawn, and then you can see what the most serious decision in the case was. One of them got one of the charges ended up with a custody sentence, the other one probation sentence. So essentially, you get a nice view of what happened to this person in court, and then you would have that for all the cases for that person from 2005 to 2021. If you want to move on to the next slide, provide a similar example, but for the corrections data. So this person has had um, 2 correctional involvements. Uh, you have to, we have data dictionaries that describe all this, and I won't get into the details of that because it's a little bit complicated, but you can see the terms of supervision, the start date, the end date, whether it was custody or probation, and some characteristics of the individual who was under supervision. You can see, so this person ID1, you could actually link someone's court records with their correctional records as long as they were supervised in one of the 5 provinces for which we have correctional data. You can move on. Maybe just click through all these so I can have them. I might have done, yeah, okay. You can, I think one more click and it'll do it. Maybe another one. I just don't want you to have to click through. Yeah, okay, I think that's it. Perfect. So there's a number of data sets that the core justice files can be linked to look at um, either socioeconomic precursors or outcomes following justice involvement, predictors of justice involvement and continued justice involvement over time, these types of studies. So you can look at tax data, which actually includes a lot of information about family composition, employment, income, obviously. Um, yeah, I think those are the main sort of domains that there's key information in the tax files, and I feel like we all it's obvious that um, employment and income variables would be available in the tax file, but I also find the family composition variables really informative because you can see how many children they have, if they're married, common law, this type of information. Um, the other sort of group of files that are available for integration are the hospitalization files. So these include the National Ambulatory Care Reporting System and the Discharge Abstract Database. Both of these are can be combined to get a measure of emergency department visits in Canada. So it has pretty good coverage. I think Quebec might be the only outlier, but there's documentation associated with each of these files that would need to be reviewed by the researchers when they plan to, if they do plan to use them. But basically, the way that I've used these files for the most part is to get an indicator of basically how many emergency department visits a person had uh, prior to or after involvement with the justice system. There's also indicate like variables that indicate the type of issue that like the reason why they presented themselves or they were brought to the emergency department. So these range from like behavioral, like mental health issues or general physical health issues, accidents. So there's a lot of different codes that you can look at, and then obviously there's a ton of other health-related information that you can look at in these files that I haven't even been able to scratch the surface on, because it's not really my personal area of expertise, these health data files, but there's so much information in them. And then there's also the Ontario Mental Health Reporting System, which is really mostly Ontario psychiatric facility data, which can also be interesting if you're looking at an Ontario sample. The next set of files would be the post-secondary education. So this includes the post-secondary student information system, that's like universities, and then the registered apprenticeship information system, obviously apprenticeship programs. Unfortunately, we don't have a similar data set for high school, which is really unfortunate. I've looked into it, and we just don't have like the personal identifiers on those files to do these types of linkage with. But the post-secondary education files can provide some useful information on enrollment and completion of post-secondary education. Um, in terms of the census, we do have 3 census cycles. Well, I should say technically 2 census cycles in the National Household Survey, which was conducted in 2011 because we didn't have a census. But it can be sort of thought of in a similar way, although it has some some specific characteristics that need to be considered as well. So we have so you have the ability to link to the census from one of our core justice files. So obviously the census long form, it has a ton of socioeconomic information in it, from education to um, employment and languages and family composition information. And obviously, it varies a little bit from census to census, but it really is a great source of information. There are some caveats around the use of the census file that I'll talk a bit about a little bit later. It is much more. I'll just say now that it's a lot more complicated to do a study with the census, because it's a sample survey, and because we're dealing with linked data files, the weights need to be adjusted for the data set, that the linked data set being used. Um, so there's some additional legwork in order to be able to actually use the census variables. So in red here, I've put the death data, which is currently in the queue for being uploaded into the CGRD. Um, so that would involve, so you'd be able to see like if people in the core data sets died at some point and the main causes of their death. And the other forthcoming data set is the immigration data set. So we're pulling only select variables from the IMDb, the longitudinal immigration database, which essentially would allow you to see the earliest date of immigration and or the earliest date of their effective permit for non-permanent residency. We're having a little bit of issues with the IMDb ID right now, and the linkage, which we're trying to sort out. So that one might take a little bit longer to get uploaded into the platform, but it is coming. I think we can move on to the next one. Okay, so in terms of analytical considerations, as I said a number of times already, the ICCS and the CCSS, the justice files, must be used as the core in any analysis. They need to be the cohort of the analysis. So the population of the study. So for example, the census as a whole can't be used as the cohort of analysis, at least under the current approvals for this database. So you can't, so someone might want to use the census to create like a comparison group of non-justice involved people for their study, but currently that's not covered under the approvals for the current database. So when you're planning your study, it would have to be starting with a court involved or a corrections involved population from either the ICCS or the CCSS, and then you're using that base file to link to the other data sets. So just keep that in mind when planning a research study using this database. I will say that additional approvals can be sought for different studies. So studies wanting to use the census as a cohort base, for example, but this would come with additional work, additional costs, just to get the approvals in place for that. So most of the data sets in this database are administrative, which is nice because they include a lot of information on sort of like a census of the populations in which we're interested in. Um, Not to be confused with the the census survey, but um, there's no sampling in the when we're talking about administrative data. So there's no need to use weighting or anything like that. The exception is the census survey, which does have a sampling frame. So the last census, I believe it was 1 in 4 Canadians were administered the survey, and on reserves, it's 100%. So there's a sampling frame that needs to be considered when using the census. And you're also working with a much smaller population that can then be linked to the like much smaller proportion of the data will end up linking to the census because it was only um, uh, sent to a proportion of the Canadian population. And also keeping in mind that administrative data won't have things like what were the person's attitudes, a- and these types of more psychological cognitive variables that we might get from survey research. This administrative data is kind of the flip side, where we're getting um, more static information about individuals. So when conducting studies in the CGRD, linkage rates should always be on your mind. It's the more data sets you bring together, the smaller your sample will likely become. There's obviously gaps in different data sets. For example, if you're linking to the tax files, the TIFF, and you're interested in a given tax year, only a proportion there's a proportion of the sample who won't have filed their taxes in that year. So you may want to make adjustments to include like a range of tax years, for example, to increase the proportion of individuals for who you have tax information, for example. Um, and what was I going to say? Oh, yes, and the population that we're dealing with, the criminal justice population, we found is even less likely to file their taxes than the general population. So this really does need to be a consideration. And we also, when talking about limitations of our studies, we have to mention that our linkages, like our results, don't reflect the population who didn't link to that particular um, data set that we're looking at for whatever reason. I mean, particularly talking about the tax data, um, it's possible that the population that didn't link may represent a slightly different group than the ones who did link. So obviously, just considering these things when thinking about the limitations of your study. Um, in terms of reference periods, the files have different reference periods. So, for example, the court data was from 2005 to 2021, whereas the corrections data was only available from 2015 to 2021. So, obviously, you need to consider the different time frames, and also certain data sets are maintained by calendar year, whereas others are maintained by fiscal year. So I won't go too much into it, but just something that you need to consider. And then using the census, I already kind of went into this, but there's a need to develop calibrated weights for the census for the given population that you're looking at. So once you've identified the sample of data that you're interested in, so whether that be um, men released from custody in whatever year or individuals charged with like car theft in 2018 or something like that. So once you have your cohort of analysis, you'll need to develop calibrated census weights for your sample. So we do have some documentation on this to help researchers. And we're also currently developing some programs, pretty rudimentary programs for at least basic um, calibration. So probably the most straightforward way to create calibrated census weights. This is what we're working on to help researchers kind of just to have like these standard programs that can be populated with the variables of interest and the data sets being used. So we have an analyst working on that in Stata and in R, just to kind of help with that process because we do understand it's a little bit complicated. I don't know why I did that. That is so funny. So to submit a proposal, you can go to this link here. Has an application process and guidelines. We just to kind of keep your eye out for. We are currently working on some more detailed instructions for researchers, particularly those who are submitting proposals for the CJRD. They're not up there yet, but eventually they'll be in the instructions as a sort of specialized instruction. Yeah, there are already some for I think like the census file and some another file in there. So you might see what I'm talking about, but essentially we want to just we'll provide more information to help researchers provide us really the information that we're looking for, so there'll be less back and forth with researchers. So we're kind of learning as we go. It's a brand new platform. We've learned a lot from the first batch of proposals that we received, and the researchers were just starting to use the data. So there's definitely some growing pains. We're learning, we're trying continuously to improve the platform and make it easier to use. So just know that there's still changes to come, improvements to come, more documentation to come to help those using the data in there. And if you have any suggestions when you're using it, please let us know. But in terms of the general requirements for RDC proposals, you need to submit the proposal. Upon approval, the researchers would have to become deemed employees as Statistics Canada, and again, they'll need reliability security status. And just as a reminder, only non-confidential aggregate statistical information can actually leave the RDC. So we have vetting rules in place that RDC analysts will use to vet any output that is created by the researchers using the RDCs. So before you can bring anything home with you, well, essentially it'll be sent to you by the vetting team after it's been vetted using our vetting rules. And I think, is that it? Yes. This must have happened automatically. I'm sure I didn't do that. So you can feel free to contact me. That's my email. If you have some questions about the CGRD, I did provide the CGRD user guide in to Grant before the meeting, so it should be in the zip file for you to access. And that really outlines in more detail all the information that I talked about today. We are even working on an updated version of the guide that addresses some of the gaps that people had questions about in the first version. So uh, I would say that the platform itself is kind of evergreen, and there'll be a number of updates, I think, before we're completely content with it. But the user guide as it is now should be a great start for anyone wanting to submit a research proposal. And I think that's it.
Okay, thanks so much, Chloe. We had a few Q&A things. This is set up as a meeting, so if you want to pop your camera back on, if you have a question, kind of raise your hand so that it's not a total free-for-all. I think there's like 50 people here, so that gets a little crazy. There's a few chats as Chloe was speaking, so maybe I could address those since they were in the chat. The first one was you mentioned high school data. So Michael correctly pointed out that there's BC K to 12 data within the longitudinal labor market platform. We also have high school data from Ontario in that platform. Is there any possibility that SDLE would link those to the CJRD, or what's the...
Yeah, I guess as a first phase, we considered mostly national data sets, although I do recognize we do have the OMHRS Ontario mental health reporting system in there because it's always kind of grouped with the data and the NACRS. But yeah, if there are other data sources, I think there would be a lot of interest in bringing those in. I do think the BC one, I think that one is an SDLE, and so which would mean it's easily uh, integrated with the CGRD.
Mhm.
And I didn't know about the Ontario one actually. So there's
That's
also
new.
an Ontario one. Okay. So yeah, I think in the future, if there is interest in that, that's definitely something we can look into. It was always the intention to keep adding data sets to the platform. So it's not like complete. This kind of just like phase one. So yeah, that's a really great point. Thank you.
Okay, so I see, Anthony, I see your hand, but Christine Hinchley, you had your hand up and then you put it down. Was that an accident hand?
No, I'll let Anthony speak because he's probably
Okay.
speaking to the same subject anyway. Thanks.
Okay, sounds good. Go ahead, Anthony.
Sorry, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to pop in. I am responsible for overseeing the Education and Labor Market Longitudinal Platform, which has the core files of PCIS, RAISE, and TIP. So first off, thank you very much. Chloe, this is always intricate kind of conversations and a great job trying to bring everything together under one umbrella. I do have a couple of questions and a couple of statements. So aside from TIFF, one thing that we're testing out, and I know there's a 2-year project looking at APIM, so the administrative personal income master file. That's another source that will give you tax-related information. It goes a little bit beyond the T1 family file. It'll give you additional sources, and given the population of interest, you may want more information on social assistance and dependency on government funding. So that might be another small thing to think about. I was going to pipe in as Christine. We do have BC K to 12 and Ontario 9 to 12 that are already linked within the SDLE and within the LMLP. Glad
Oh,
to see. I
okay.
was going to jump in, Chloe, to just to recognize or to acknowledge the importance of these alternative weights when linking to the census. We've had success in doing so with our PCIS, which covers universities and colleges. And also for RAISE. So we're working through our registered apprenticeship for the same reason. So another small recommendation. What is conspicuously absent from your list of justice, we have 3 sectors within the justice system that make up our justice system, aside from civil courts and so on. Policing. So we have a significant number of incidents that happen every year. And especially when we're talking about the young youth population, there are a lot of diversion programs in place, and there's also alternative measures for adults. So there's a number of individuals that have touch points depending on the question of interest. This was critical when we stood up the opioids project because we were less concerned, although it was important to know about the formal processing through the justice system from courts and then on to corrections. As we know, it's a funnel. So it gets narrower and narrower as we move through the system. Is there an intention to look a little bit more closely at the UCR? And if so, or if not, I guess if not, are there challenges that you just can't overcome when it comes to the UCR itself, the Uniform Crime Reporting Survey, for others? Yeah.
Yeah, great question. I will say the APIM is on our radar. We
Excellent.
just needed more time to take a look at it, but we have found that we do get additional information on social assistance. Thank you for the recommendation on the high school data, which I wasn't
Yeah.
really aware was in the ELMLP. So that is kind of like a low-hanging fruit for us that we could probably bring in relatively easily in our next phase. UCR, so the Uniform Crime Reporting Survey, we have done a lot of work to try to link the survey. I would say I'm confident we'll get it into the platform in the future. The issue so far has been that the only police service that has almost full coverage of name information on the UCR is Ontario, the OPP. We're working, like the UCR team is currently working with police service as a whole to update the survey to collect like it's the names that we're missing, which are really important in linkage, which is kind of what's preventing us from fully onboarding the UCR into our integrated database. I will say we've done a lot of testing to try to figure out how to link it. So we have a variable called soundx, which is like an anonymized name variable, which we have attempted to use along with a host of geographic variables to link the UCR. And we're at about a 60% linkage with all that. But we haven't had time to really assess the limitations of that linkage rate and actually use that link data ourselves. So our decision was to not include the UCR in this phase before we can learn more about that linkage, because recently was the first time we did all that work to bring to link that data. I mean, every year that passes, we get higher and higher linkage rates. So I think in the near future, maybe, I don't know, I don't want to make any promises, but within the next 5 years, I would hope that we would have the UCR in the CGRD, because I do agree it's a really important piece of the justice data that is obviously lacking. The UCR itself is available as a file in the RDC, but just the linkage is not available.
Yeah, thank you for that. I had a feeling it was on the personal identifiers. It always has plagued the UCR. And then there's always the working assumption, well, you have fingerprint. Well, fingerprint is only for certain cases that proceed, right? You have to commit a certain level of crime and seriousness to get a fingerprint. So great, thank you. I had a feeling that, and yeah, we're accustomed to enjoying higher linkage rates than in the 60%. If probably would make us a little nervous if it wasn't in the 90s. So hats off to continuing to pursue that. And I agree with you with the soundx. This would require you changing the systems, the RMS systems at the other end to capture maybe a longer soundx than the 6-digit or the Henri code in Quebec. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of heavy lifting to answer that question in the future. But it's about as important as elementary high school is to the longitudinal story of a learner, and that goes on to post-secondary and labor market. So I think that first contact with police is really critical as well, to better understanding touch points if we're trying to understand subpopulations of individuals that have a higher risk of contact with the justice system, and how do we divert them through education and other means, substance use, whatever the case may be. So thank you. Excellent.
Completely agree.
We've got other hands and some questions in the chat, so I'd like to pause this one. And Chloe's put her email if you want to reach out to her after. So speaking, kind of just picking up on some of the linkage rate questions, we did have a question in the chat from earlier, probably while you were speaking. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of linkage to the T1? I mean, this is probably a population that's sort of disproportionately unlikely to file their taxes. Can you just comment on the sort of percentages, the quality, like what your sort of sense within the department is about that linkage?
I'm trying to remember, like off the top of my head, I think it's like about 60% for any given year.
Okay.
For the court population, I believe it's around that.
Mm-hmm.
So that would mean 40% of your sample did not. We've had a bit of better luck expanding the number of years that someone, like if they didn't link to 2015, will allow a linkage to 2014 as well for those without. So you can expand because some people will submit one year, not the other. It's possible they were incarcerated. Like, who knows? That's why they didn't submit their taxes. So yeah, there's a bit of like playing around and learning a little bit. Yeah. Does that
Okay.
answer the question around
It
60?
does, yeah. And I was just going to comment, the emergency department and hospitalization visits, those are all data from CIHI, so those are sort of collected from the hospitals directly through sort of CIHI's processes, and there's a wealth of documentation on that quality. We don't have it for Quebec just because of the way the data sharing agreements work out. So Chloe was right to flag that. But the sort of that documentation is available, and that actually that's administrative from the hospitals and the clinics, so that should be sort of complete. It's not like there's a filing behavior issue there. That's going to select your people who are linked. I know Anne Marie's had her hand up for a while, so I'm going to ask her to ask her question.
Sure, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for this presentation. I noticed that when we were looking at examples of the data, the CCSS had variables for Vismin and Indigenous. Is there any way to do that for the ICCS or not yet?
Unfortunately, it's not collected by the survey. Yeah, and that's been a huge gap for us. One way that we have done research on the court population is by linking to the census and developing some census weights. So we'll grab the Indigenous or visible minority variables from the census and then use weighted data to try to answer some of those questions about the court population. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Oh, it's good to know because I have access to it right now. So, but I just got access, so I'm trying to figure out if I can do it with the ICCS or if I should use the CCS. So, thank you I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
And Timothy Kang has also got his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Have we gone through all the chat questions already, or I'll just take
but go ahead.
Yeah, okay. You mentioned weighting, and I'm just curious whether or not, in order to get the results out, we'll have to use weights or not. And you also mentioned like specific or like customized weights for analyses. I was just wondering if you could speak more on the expectations of weighting in these analyses.
So this would only be if you're using census data. If you're using census data, you absolutely need to use weights. There's no way around it. Based on sort of a number of conversations with our methodologists, it's been determined that census weights, as they appear on the census data, cannot be directly applied to a linked special population. And this is because the linkage is not 100%, so you need to account for the linkage rate between the files, and you need to account for the fact that your target population likely doesn't have the exact same characteristics as the Canadian population. So that's what I'm talking about when I say calibrated weights. There's a calibration that needs to happen on the census weights that appear on the file. in order for them to be valid for whatever for the justice population that you choose to work with. So we're in
Right.
the process of
Yeah,
developing. Yeah.
yeah, I understand that like the ICCS or any of the justice surveys won't be representative of the Canadian population. And so like that makes no sense to use weights that are trying to represent the Canadian population with a population level survey. But is the intent here to weight the analysis to represent for example, the incarcerated population or the criminal justice involved population, or is it still
Yeah,
meant to
sorry.
try to pull it
Yeah,
all the way back out to the general population?
yeah, I wasn't clear about that. So whatever your identified population, let's just say it's men released from custody in 2015. That becomes your population. So once you link to the census, likely around 19%, like 50 between 15 and 20% will link to the long form census that you choose to link to. That's our experience. So that 19% that linked becomes your analytical file, and the weights are developed so that those 19% are reflective of all men released from custody in 2016. So reflective of your population of interest for your study.
Right. And to get those calibrated weights, like we would construct them to reflect that population.
Yeah, so when you're calibrating the sort of like the totals, like you'll pick out whatever information that's relevant that's available. Like we've calibrated weights using like criminal history, age, sex, whatever variables we have available and that we think could potentially um, have an impact on the results based on how many people how much of that group is reflected in the data. I mean, obviously it's never perfect because you can never account for all potential characteristics, unmeasured characteristics that are not being calibrated for, but at least you're not disaggregating your analyses based on those characteristics because we don't have those variables. So basically, you would want to prioritize like categories that you're going to use in your analyses in your calibration to ensure that at least those calibrated results are reflective of your population. It's a little bit complicated, so we have some documentation to try to that like explains how to do this, and that's why we are building these standard programs to help researchers just kind of like plug in the variables they want. But we can definitely provide more information on that, and that's actually the part that we're planning on adding to the user guide is a section on the weighting.
Okay. Yeah, I
Thanks,
guess,
Chloe.
yeah, just sorry.
No, it's okay. Tim, you can follow up with me if you want. This is not the first question. This is not the first time that Chloe and I have heard this question about the census data, so we're happy to kind of share a little bit more with you if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. That'd be great.
So there's a couple of questions in the chat asking about incarceration data, federal versus provincial, and if it's possible to determine which system they're involved with or what that looks like.
Yeah,
So
so
start with that.
all the data that's in the CGRD right now, the corrections data, it's all provincial program data. So we actually don't have any federal corrections data in there at the moment. As I said, we are working with CSC to onboard them onto the CCSS. So my hope is that soon, in the next couple years, the federal corrections data will be available in the CGRD.
Okay.
But yeah, that's a really important distinction when you're talking about this population. It's harder to distinguish between the two systems and from the court data. Like you can always look at whether someone received a sentence of 2 years or more or something like that, but it's not always ends up being that way in the end. But yeah, it's a little less clear from the court data.
Okay. All right, that's very helpful. So the thinking on the federal data timeline is not like 6 months, it's within the next couple of years is sort of a
Well, we're only getting we're working on the programming right now for that data. I just don't want to promise
overpromise.
too
Gotcha.
early. Yeah, and I think it's possible that it'll be sooner, but yeah, I'm nervous about yeah, overpromising.
Okay, and I didn't there was a last question about the data dictionary, and I didn't actually look at what you sent me because I didn't have a ton of time. The user guide, does it have like a list of variables, or is it, in some
It ha-
way data dictionary-esque?
We have separate data dictionaries, which I could also provide. I mean, they're available in the RDC, but we can send them
If they're not
if those.
confidential, I'd love to have them because we can just share them through our site.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that is fine because they're external facing. So yeah, we can just share. I can share those with you for the ICCS and the CCSS. The other ones, like the Kai High ones obviously are online. I
Yeah.
would have to confirm like with whether the TIFF data dictionary, yeah, like I wouldn't like want to share. It's not okay. Like
No.
yeah, so we could share our data, which I think is the most important for
Yeah.
this research, at least to get started on your analysis. But and some of the other data sets you can find information online. But in the user guide, we do have a list of the variables that are included. So you can at least see the name of the variable, although you won't have all the information. So for each data set in the appendix at the end, we have tables showing what variables are included in each file. And something I didn't really get into because it's a little bit more technical, but some files like the TIFF and the Kai-Hi files, we have supplementary data sets sort of in the platform for you ready to use, whereas the census and the linkages to the post-secondary education data sets. We actually provide concordance keys that allow you to merge in data sets that are already housed elsewhere in the RDC. So I don't want to get too much into that, but there are some distinctions between the different types of files. So when you go down to the appendix, you'll see some data sets only have like 3 or 4 variables, and it's just because they're concordance keys rather than actual data sets.
Yeah. Can I probe a little bit? You mentioned sort of offhand if that's the long form census you choose to link to. So one of the things that people tend to think they should be able to do, but can't because it's not part of the privacy assessment, is kind of use a central database to link multiple waves of long form census. Can you comment on that and what is allowed and what isn't allowed? Like, one long form census per person or one long form census per project? Like what's the current rules around that?
We have approved multiple long form censuses per project, but they can't just all be like merged together. And that wouldn't really work with the weights either. Um, yeah, basically it was just not something that we would we allow at this time. Like I did definitely see where people are getting at with it, but like from a technical perspective, we haven't really been able to figure that one out either in terms of like just the differences in sampling frames and stuff either. Yeah. So basically, that's a good point. You can do separate cohorts linked to separate censuses to kind of compare things, but yeah, you're not just throwing all the censuses and into a data set together.
I mean, it's, I understand why people think it's a good idea because it seems intuitive that like, oh, if I don't have a 2016 observation, I could just use the 2021 and then that way I'll have more data. But the questions around sampling do get bigger, especially when it's like a 25% sort of random sample of a non-random population, and it complicates itself quickly. So I just wanted to make sure that that was appeared in the show notes. So thank you,
That's a good
Chloe.
point. Yeah.
And thank you everyone for attending. If there's any more questions, I know it's like right on 2 o'clock and people are starting to vanish, which is totally fair. We'll post this link, or we'll post this to our YouTube channel. So if you're interested in reviewing it, that'd be awesome. And last thing is to just give Chloe a round of applause, virtual or audible.
Well, thanks,
Mostly virtual.
everyone.
Okay. Thanks so much. Hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.